It is January 1692 in Salem Village, Massachusetts. The cold New England winter wrapped itself around wooden houses and narrow streets, but something far more unsettling had taken hold inside those houses: fits, screams, convulsions. A handful of young girls, frightened, feverish, and terribly convincing, began to shout that invisible hands were pinching, pricking, and choking them. They pointed at neighbors
and claimed those neighbors' specters were the source of their torment. And so a small, isolated community found itself on the edge of a precipice. The Massachusetts Bay Colony of 1692. The Massachusetts Bay Colony of 1692 was a place shaped by a rigid and literal faith. The Puritans who had settled there brought with them a theological worldview that left no room for ambiguity about evil. Satan was real, the devil walked among men, and witches were his agents. This worldview was not the product of hysteria alone. It had deep cultural roots across both Europe and the American colonies. Witchcraft prosecutions were a familiar, if dreadful, phenomenon. In that climate, the girls' accusations did not sound fanciful. They sounded like a call to defend the community from a supernatural invasion. The first accusations centered on 3 women: Sarah Good, a poor and unpopular vagrant; Sarah Osborne, who had recently quarreled with her in-laws and was regarded with suspicion; and Tituba, an enslaved woman from the Caribbean who served in the Paris household. The girls' fits and their insistence that these women's spirits were attacking them created a ripple of fear. When Tituba, under intense pressure, confessed a lurid tale of compacts with the devil, a book written in blood, a tall man from Boston who urged her to sign, the girls and the sympathetic townsfolk took this confession as confirmation. Whether Tituba's confession was coerced, theatrical, or sincere, its effect was immediate and devastating. It made the phenomenon real in the public imagination. As the days passed, more children and young women began to seize and shriek. Fingers were pointed in increasing numbers. The jails filled with the accused. In spring, the provincial authorities intervened and appointed judges to hold formal inquiries and trials. The legal proceedings that followed rested on an evidentiary concept both foreign and perilous to modern sensibilities: spectral evidence. If an accuser swore she had seen the specter, the apparition or spirit, of the accused tormenting her, that testimony was admissible. The logic was terrifyingly circular and effectively impossible to refute. How could one disprove the claim that one's spirit, visible only to an accuser, had been dispatched to do harm? The courts, influenced by the fevered atmosphere, the religious assumptions of the age, and the emotional testimonies of the afflicted, issued guilty verdicts. Executions began in July of 1692. Bridget Bishop was the first to be hanged on July 10th. Over the next months, more followed. The official tally would reach 19 who were hanged, and one man, Giles Corey, who was pressed to death by heavy stones after refusing to enter a plea. Another 7 languished and died in jail. The methods were public and intended to terrify and deter. Accused witches were taken to a hill outside the town, tied, and hanged before the eyes of the community. The accused came from diverse social strata. At first, many of the accused were marginal figures: poor women, the elderly, the unstable. But as accusations multiplied, the circle widened to include respected members of the community: prosperous women who owned land, men of standing, and those who had previously spoken against the court. Property and independence, especially among widows who controlled land or businesses, sometimes made women targets. Rumors and personal vendettas overlapped with religious fervor. The trials did not emerge in a social vacuum. Long-standing disputes about property lines, church governance, family quarrels, and local politics all fed the accusatory blaze. The trials might have been halted sooner, but their momentum carried them forward. Spectral evidence proved seductive because it matched an existing cosmology. If Satan could enter the world, he could do so by borrowing a person's shape. When the girls testified, they seemed to know the private affairs of the accused, or at least what would alarm their neighbors. For many observers, the girls' dramatic displays were incontrovertible proof. The legal system of the day, a system that had not yet evolved a rigorous standard for assessing psychological testimony or coercion, lacked the tools to filter out falsehoods or to recognize mass hysteria. As the accusations moved toward the town's elite, when the wives of influential men and other pillars of the community were named, public opinion began to shift. It is one thing to accept that the poor and socially marginal might be in league with dark forces. It is another when accusations threaten those who uphold the social order. Once the lines of class and power were crossed, the legitimacy of
the proceedings started to crumble. People who had previously trusted the court and the accusers now feared that anyone might be targeted. The governor, alarmed by the widening scope and the reliance on spectral evidence, eventually put a stop to the special court in October of 1692. In the aftermath, the community had to confront the damage. Some accused witches were released, but they were released to a world that had already been altered. Reputations shattered, families bankrupted by jail fees, lives scarred permanently. Those who died could not be restored, and those who survived carried the memory of public humiliation and cruelty. Some victims and their allies pursued civil suits for defamation and false imprisonment. A few succeeded, securing partial financial redress. Over the longer term, the colony sought legal remedies. By 1696, the General Court declared the trials unlawful, an acknowledgement that the process had been corrupted by error and prejudice. Historians, legal scholars, and psychologists have long debated the causes of the girls' behavior and the broader social dynamics that enabled the catastrophe. Several theories have been advanced. One suggests that ergotism, poisoning from a fungus, ergot, that can contaminate rye and cause convulsions and hallucinations, may have produced the symptoms. Another emphasizes mass psychogenic illness, where stress, anxiety, and suggestion produce real physiological reactions shared by a group. Still others point to socioeconomic and political tensions, factionalism within the village, disputes over church leadership, economic resentment, and gendered power dynamics. Some scholars also highlight the role of adolescent rebellion or attention-seeking alongside the pressures of a strict theocratic culture. No single explanation fully satisfies every specialist. More likely, a confluence of biological, psychological, social, and cultural factors produced the tragedy. The Salem witch trials also served as a harsh lesson about evidence and justice. The use of spectral testimony violated a basic principle later enshrined in more mature legal systems: the need for reliable, corroborated evidence and the presumption of innocence. The trials illustrated how fear can warp legal processes, producing convictions based on emotion rather than proof. In law schools today, the Salem events are studied not only as a historical curiosity, but as a cautionary tale about due process, the dangers of hearsay, and the vulnerability of institutions when they mirror communal panic rather than rational inquiry. Over the centuries, Salem itself wrestled with its legacy. The town, once synonymous with hysteria and wrongful executions, eventually erected memorials to honor those who suffered. Apologies and attempts at redress, including, centuries later, official proclamations and legislative acts aimed at clearing names and acknowledging injustice, reflected a communal desire to atone, however belatedly. The trials also entered the wider cultural imagination, becoming a powerful metaphor. Witch hunts came to describe any campaign of persecution fueled by suspicion and zeal rather than evidence, a shorthand for the perils of scapegoating. Modern retellings of the Salem story have continued to probe its disturbing lessons. Playwrights, novelists, and filmmakers have used the trials to examine the dynamics of accusation, the fragility of reputation, and the corrosive effects of fear on civic life. Social scientists have used Salem as an early case study in group behavior and moral panic. The events remind us how communities can, under strain, turn inward and seek simple explanations for complex anxieties. They show how vulnerable institutions are when they fail to demand rigorous standards for truth. Ultimately,
the gravity of the Salem episode lies not only in its immediate brutality, but in the way it exposes recurring patterns of human behavior. Across time and place, similar cascades of accusation and retribution have erupted when societies face uncertainty, scarcity, or rapid change. The names and settings vary, but the mechanisms, rumor, the elevation of fear over reason, the institutionalization of prejudice, repeat. That is why descendants and historians continue to study the trials, not merely to catalog wrongs, but to illuminate how to guard against their recurrence. The Salem witch trials remain a painful and instructive chapter in American history. 19 executed, 7 dead in prison, and a town rent by hysteria and fear. They demonstrate how easily a community's moral rigor